Human beings do not like to admit when they are wrong. It is painful and agonizing. It takes a shot to your ego. It makes you feel horrible about yourself. But sometimes admitting when we are wrong is the only way forward. That's the only way to improve your mind, to improve the world. It's better for you and everyone around you. But there are some groups of people who are incapable of admitting when they're wrong. Now, there are plenty of examples we can pick from, but one of them for sure are modern-day communists. Now, granted, there's a lot less of them than there was 100 years ago, thankfully, but there's still a lot of people who make claims like, oh, Stalin was the cynical opportunist who ruined the Soviet Union, and if Trotsky had been the leader, things would have been a lot better. It really would have been a socialist utopia. So today we're going to be doing a little bit of a discussion on that idea of whether or not Trotsky would have been a better leader for the Soviet Union. But more on that in a moment. Hello everyone, Michael McCauley here, today on Our Dark History, where we discuss the darkest people, places, and events in human history. Today we are going to be honestly looking at the question as if whether or not Trotsky would have been a better Soviet leader than Stalin. Now, this is a really tricky thing to deal with because we can only theorize so much. Ultimately, this is speculation. This is, it's just kind of conjecture on some ways. But I do think it's important to really ask questions like this because your answer to this is going to change what your idea of communism is. Right? I mean, if you think that Leon Trotsky would have brought, if you genuinely believe Trotsky would have led the Soviet Union into a positive, progressive, idealistic utopia, well, it's very easy to, spread communism again, right? And that's despite all of the examples where it has torn civilizations apart and decimated entire people groups and, all kinds of horrible stuff. So I do think these questions are difficult, but they are still worth answering. Now, a little disclaimer, I am not a historian, so I'm only a fan of history, right? I'm currently working on a Biocast episode on Trotsky, which will be coming out soon. Hope you guys are excited about that. But without any further ado, let's get right on in to the discussion. So, what if Trotsky took control instead of Stalin? There would be more bloodshed in Europe. Now, you might ask, why would there be more bloodshed in Europe? Specifically, right? Trotsky took more risk. Trotsky was, during 1905, he developed his philosophy of permanent revolution. Basically, that they were going to continue to spread revolution as much as humanly possible. And they were not going to stop. There was no, let's sit back and try to consolidate our gains. Trotsky was like, we need more revolution everywhere, all the time, in every country. And he thought that the real revolutionary goal was particularly Germany. Because Germany was kind of symbolic as it was the place that was the most industrialized, it was the most powerful at the time, right? If you look at any of the individual nation states during the 1900s, really, it was Germany. They had a massive population. They were industrialized. I mean, it was like you took the industrialization of the United Kingdom and you combined it with the manpower of Russia, and that's what Germany was. So they were just a massive, massive player. And a lot of the communists recognized that if they wanted to spread communism, they were going to have to start a revolution in Germany. It had to start there, and then it was just going to spread everywhere else. And the fact that it happened in Russia, well, it was just kind of like, okay, we can hold things here, but Russia is not our primary goal. Russia is not, even according to Karl Marx, it had to happen in the most industrialized part of the world. And, when it happens in a place like Russia, well, what's going to happen is, well, you go from an agrarian society, which is, low tech, low industrialization, not a lot of economy. There's just a bunch of small town people living in villages, right? Farming villages. And, it's kind of hard to redistribute that, right? And then as we eventually saw with the Soviet Union was, well, they still tried and they kind of caused a famine or two. 12 million deaths, you know how it is. But anyway, so yeah, the goal was Germany, especially for someone like Trotsky. Now, the next big thing to point out is that Stalin was of a completely different viewpoint. He wanted to conserve what they had achieved. He wanted to consolidate Russia and make it purely socialistic, communistic. He wanted Russia to be a Soviet socialist republic. And then we can deal with spreading communism later, right? Like spreading communism, like that's fine and dandy, but I don't really care. I want to consolidate my own power. So in some ways, you can almost make the argument that Joseph Stalin was like a conservative or a right-wing communist. As weird as that sounds, right? I'm not saying that he's, actually a right-winger, but if you look at it, in practice, he just wants to consolidate what they've achieved. It's in the sentence, right? Conservative. So it's just really weird seeing the contrast between him and Leon Trotsky, whereas Trotsky is like, he really believes in the propaganda that he writes. He actually believes it. And that is such a unique thing, because I think a lot of these extremists during this point in time in history, whether it's in Russia with the communists or the fascists in Germany or elsewhere, it really takes a unique person to push out propaganda that they genuinely and wholeheartedly believe. I think you have a lot more cases where people, they just kind of push stuff like, all right, if I tell people this, they will give me state power and they will, subjugate themselves to my command. Trotsky's not one of those people. I don't think that's not the vibe I get off of him at all. And, I say this with quite a bit of, having done some research on this. So it's just really, really interesting because Stalin, man, he was crazy. He was like, I'm going to push this button and it's going to get me more power. I don't care about ideology. I don't care about Marxism or Lenin or the revolution. I just care about myself and my power. And it kind of really lays the framework for what we now know as totalitarianism, where there's basically one leader of the state who's worshipped as a god. That really started with Joseph Stalin. And it's just insane to see. It's really sad. And if you want to learn more about Joseph Stalin, by the way, I have a Biocast episode on his life. So if you want to download that, I will have a link to that in the description or the pinned comment, one of those places. Maybe the show notes if you're listening to the podcast version. But yeah, what a crazy guy. But let's move on. So if Trotsky took control of the Soviet Union as opposed to Stalin, there would have been less internal strife. Now that sounds good on the surface, but again, let's look at some of the more details. Trotsky never wanted to kill a fellow communist. That wasn't his shtick. He believed in Marxism, and even if someone was ideologically opposed to him, right? Like during the Menshevik-Bolshevik disagreement, he was consistently like, we need to drop the petty hoopla and we need to unite as communists. That was his whole thing. And eventually the Bolsheviks took power and he just kind of went along with the Bolsheviks because, that's what you do when you don't want to be killed. But he really wanted, the whole idea of Marxism, he wanted everyone under this one umbrella, this one banner. And unfortunately, that's just not how human beings operate, but that's the way he, like I said, he really believed in the propaganda he spewed. He really took it to heart. Whereas Stalin, oh boy, he killed a lot of communists. And, it's almost funny, too, because I remember seeing the other day a history meme, and it was it was Finland and Germany, and they're Nazi Germany, and they're having a conversation, and Finland's like, I killed 50,000 communists, and Germany's like, I killed 8 million communists, and then, it's like the Soviet Union over there is in the corner, he's like, amateurs, you amateurs, and it's just, like, it's kind of goofy, but it's like so true. It is so true, because no one killed more Russian communists than Russian communists. And it is just such an insane fact. Seeing a movement like this eat itself alive in real time. It must, of course, let's acknowledge it is tragic and horrible. Thankfully, we have a little bit of separation, right? There's quite a bit of time between this period of history and us today. Thankfully so, because, oh my gosh. But it must have been so tragic. We can sit around and joke about it now, but imagine everyone in your family being sent to the gulag and killed, or, whatever other unspeakable things happen in the gulag, because there's a lot of crazy stuff, right? Just reading some of the accounts of the monstrous torture and psychological manipulation that went on there, it's just really tragic. But I just can't even imagine having someone you love or even yourself going through that kind of stuff. Really tragic. Now, with Stalin, though, he was the one that brought that about. The whole, oh, you're not a real communist. You're not a real comrade. You're a capitalist pig working for the other side. That's really, he just had this massive paranoia. And part of it was kind of understandable to an extent, because, right, when you have revolution and change of government, after one revolution, that's when another revolution happens. And, like Stalin understood that, right? And I almost can't blame him for being a little paranoid, because, well, if you weren't paranoid, you got shot in the back of the head or ice picked, right? It's just kind of sad. And I know with Joseph Stalin, it's definitely one of those cases where they studied a lot of the French Revolution, and they paid very close attention to what happened there. And what happened was the military basically took control of the state. When you have massive instability, or instability, whichever word, I don't know. I'm not smart enough to know. When you have this internal chaos, it's just like, it's really difficult to establish control. And it's like, more often than not, it's just like the military is like, well, we've got the guns, so, well, I guess we're in charge now. That's what happens in a lot of these Latin American countries that face internal strife. You look at what's going on in Venezuela. If there's no intervention, there's a good chance something like that happens. Because after all, the military, they're the guys with the guns. Any other faction of people, they can say and do whatever they want, but the guys with the guns are going to take control. Look at Augusto Pinochet, or even, with Nazi Germany, it's like, they were lucky to kind of have the military on their side. Or, well, I guess at first it was the paramilitary groups, but, unless you have a paramilitary group strong enough to fight the actual military of your government, it's kind of tough. But I digress. So Trotsky was also opposed to ethno-nationalism, right? He was of Jewish origin, which is something that played a big role in his rule and impacted him in a bunch of different ways. But he denounced the Jewish communists who lived in Russia during the time, because, there was a sizable portion of Jews who thought communism was a pretty good thing, that thought, well, it was the only answer to a very chaotic and backward, regressive regime. And, again, in some ways, you almost can't blame them. If you look at the Jewish history throughout time, getting kicked out of different countries because, it's like, of course you're always going to have your bad apples, but what has happened historically is You have Jews in one country, a few of them do something bad, right? Whether it's like, they price gouge or, you'll just always have your bad apples. And what would happen is the entire country would blame the entire Jewish community, and then there would be a pogrom where they were basically kicked out and forced out, and it's like, well, you got to go live somewhere else now. And at this particular point in history, there just happened to be a lot of Jews in Russia. And when that happens, right, you just kind of, you're just kind of surviving, hoping not to get pogromed again. And it was a really tragic way of life, but it was the reality for a lot of people. So what the Jews did in response was they kind of adopted communism early on because, well, maybe we can be comrades with people and we don't have to speak the same language or have the same ethnicity or the same culture or any of this other stuff. Because, well, what unites people otherwise? A common language, a common ancestry, a common culture. And I think the reason that there were so many Jews that were represented in the communist ranks was because this was their ticket to finally be actual people in the countries they lived in. And you can't really blame them for that. So I know there's like all these conspiracy theories. Oh, the Jews, they're trying to spread communism to take over the world. And, there's a bunch of conspiracy theories like that. Kind of hoopla. If you look at their role historically, where they've been, what's happened to them, you can't really blame them for being communists early on. And one of those examples was the Jewish Bund, which I just mentioned. So Trotsky denounced them, right? He even asked his first wife, who he had divorced by that time. He asked her, he was like, yeah, go disrupt them. We don't want the Jewish Bund to gain any power, because he saw them as nationalists. It was like, you can call yourself a communist, a Marxist, all you want. But at the end of the day, you want to speak your own language? You want to preserve your own culture and heritage? Screw you. You're not a real Marxist. So, again, it just goes back to his idealism. Trotsky was not the pragmatist. He was pragmatic in certain ways. He definitely knew how to spread the message, but he did not have the pragmatism of someone like Stalin. And it really shows. Especially because, you just gotta sit back and wonder, well, what if? What if he had been a little bit friendlier to the Jewish Bund? It probably could have won him some more allies. He was Jewish after all himself. So, you can only sit back and theorize so much. But anyway. And then you just contrast this completely with Stalin, right? So during World War II, he embraced Slavic ethno-nationalism to boost morale. Because, what else do you do to boost morale, right? You tell, oh, the Slavic race, the great Slavic race, and, all this hoopla and propaganda. He didn't actually care about the Slavs. The dude was Georgian, right? He wasn't, it's just so weird. Could you think of any other example in history where someone who is not of a certain ethnicity uses ethno-nationalism to gain support? It's just such a weird thing, man. It's like, it's like as if Napoleon Bonaparte became a French ethno-nationalist despite being Italian. It's like, Napoleon didn't really use the ethno-nationalist thing. It wasn't popular in the revolutionary crowd. But, seeing Stalin really double down on, the great Slavic race, it's just such a weird thing. Trotsky never would have done this. Trotsky, again, we can sit back and ask, well, what would have happened if the leader of the Soviet Union didn't use Slavic ethno-nationalism to garner support and boost morale? Maybe they would have lost World War II. That definitely could have been the case. Trotsky probably wouldn't have been as ruthless a military leader to win World War II if it did happen, right? Of course, we got to ask whether or not World War II happens under Trotsky. Maybe, maybe not. I think that you probably would have seen it happen a lot sooner, right? Because when communism was spreading around in Germany, especially Bavaria, right? You live under that Soviet Socialist Republic for a year or two, things get bad, things are horrible, and then you have a right-wing reaction. And out of that right-wing reaction, that's where Nazism came from. It wasn't like people genuinely believe this or that. It's like, well, this is so horrible that we have to be the complete opposite. And, well, unfortunately, you end up being the same. You know, it's like all the bad things you can say about communism, you can say about Nazism. There are very few positive qualities to either ideology in practice. Let's have that disclaimer, because everything sounds good on paper, but at the end of the day, paper is paper. But yeah, so I don't know. It's really tough to speculate on that one. It's really tough because, you may have seen a faster right-wing reaction in Germany, but then again, it could have changed the internal dynamics to such an extent that maybe you did have a communist Germany, right? Maybe Trotsky would have been successful. So he wouldn't have had to be the ruthless, let's let thousands of Russian men die. Actually, Russian men and women. Let's not forget, the Soviet Union was very fond of equality, and that meant equality between men and women too. So not only were the men drafted, not only were the children drafted, but also the women. And, you can make of that what you will. Very sad, but it essentially doubled their fighting capacity. It gave them even more manpower, and they didn't have strategy. They didn't have industrialization, but oh boy, did they have manpower. So that's kind of how they won World War II. Now, let's look at the one other big difference between Trotsky and Stalin. Trotsky was willing to reject power, even when he could have had it, right? So you can almost look at this as a positive attribute in some ways. Now, of course, again, I'm not sympathetic or anything, but I can simply praise a good trait, a good decision when one is made. And when Trotsky declined to become the Minister of Internal Affairs to not cause a backlash against the Jewish community, a pogrom, that's something that was good, right? He can acknowledge, he never played favorites, right? There are a bunch of different instances where people use the Jewish thing. Oh, he favorites the Jews, this or that. But really, he didn't. He wasn't a practicing Jew. He had no camaraderie with other Jews. To him, he really was an internationalist, a Marxist, someone that was, he may have spoke Ukrainian and Russian, or, he may have been ethnically Jewish, but to him, it was just a matter of geography and happenstance, right? He didn't really care about any of that. It didn't define him in his mind. So that's important to point out. And when the Soviet Union was initially established, he had this great position where he could, think about that. The Minister of Internal Affairs. That's a big job. You can really, you can really have some power in a position like that. And, of course, Trotsky, he was definitely full of him. He definitely thought of himself as a good leader. He thought of himself as someone that could bring about positive change in the Soviet Union. And when he declines this job, he's like, well, you know what? I could have all this power for myself, but there's going to be a backlash against the Jewish community if I do. Because, of course, one of the big, the propaganda points of the far right in Russia during the time was, oh, all the communists are Jews. None of them are actually Russian. Which, again, if you look at some of it, there is some truth to that propaganda point, but I digress. So yeah, you can really look at something like that and say, you know what? He may have been a communist. He may have actually believed it, but you know what? He didn't know any better. This was the first time that communism was officially implemented as a state policy, as an ideology. So, I feel like on that merit, you can at least say, Trotsky wasn't too bad a guy. Wasn't too bad. Of course, he was misled and everything else. And, you just kind of have to sit back and wonder, had he been born in a different place, in a different time, would he have even believed in communism? Because at the time, right? I mean, it was just a reaction to the Tsar and his horrible government. And, then their reaction spawned a reaction in Germany, and then World War II and all the other chaos that went on. But anyway, that's going to be it for the video. I really hope you guys enjoyed this little discussion here. Hope you guys have a little bit more of an idea of what the Soviet Union would have been like under Leon Trotsky as opposed to Joseph Stalin. So thank you so much. Be sure to check out all of my social links here. You can check out, I've got some documentaries on Amazon, amazon.com/v/Michael. I don't know how I got that URL, but I did somehow. So thank you to the gods of the internet. And, be sure to check out Patreon, a bunch of exclusive content there, Instagram, Twitter, Medium, all that great stuff. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. And I, Michael McCauley, will see you in the next one. Peace out.